really talk to your customers. The advice I'd give is really talk to your customers and understand what they need, not what they want.
Mm.
I think that was the one thing I think, you know, it's almost like a constant learning, being able to read between the lines, like the old Henry Ford quote. If I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. It's along those same lines of really trying to understand what is the actual things that are stopping their business from growing or causing issues for their business, not things that are nice to have. And sometimes it's hard to delineate those lines, but getting really good at delineating between what those are, make the business far more successful than anything else.
Hey everyone, this is Evan Miller here with another episode of The Inventive Journey. I'm your host, Evan Miller, the serial entrepreneur that's grown several startups into 7 and 8 figure businesses, as well as the founder and CEO of Miller IP Law, where he helps startups and small businesses with their patents and trademarks. If you ever need help with yours, just go to strategymeeting.com, grab some time with us to chat, and we're always here to help. Now, today we've got another great guest on the podcast, Arnold Kadiu. And Arnold started his journey going off to the University of Michigan and getting a mechanical engineering degree. And then afterwards worked for Ford in their electric vehicle department after graduation. And then found that the software and the sensors, there was a disconnect between the software and the sensors and the hardware. So started a side hustle to focus on this. And then after a period of time, jumped into doing that full time. So with that much as an introduction, welcome on the podcast, Arnold.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Hey, excited to have you on. So I just gave a 30-second version to a much longer journey. So why don't we rewind and unpack that a little bit and tell us a little bit about how your journey got started going off to the University of Michigan.
Yeah, so I grew up around Metro Detroit, and I always had a passion for engineering. And the University of Michigan was sort of the best choice to sort of be local and get to pursue what I wanted. And it turned out to be a wonderful choice. I loved my time at University of Michigan. While I was there, we raced solar cars. We built solar powered cars from scratch. We'd race them at 70 miles an hour across the Australian outback. And so that really shaped a lot of sort of how I view products and how I view engineering. And then from that went to go work at Ford.
So now you come out, so you say, okay, love mechanical engineering, have a great program at University of Michigan. Now, what was it? What was it that took you to Ford? And then, our car manufacturer, so there's certainly probably a lot of opportunity there. But kind of, how did you settle on Ford, and how did you figure out kind of what you're going to do as you're coming out of graduation?
Yeah, so it's kind of a little bit of a roundabout story. So my parents and I immigrated to the U.S. when I was about 3 years old, and so when we moved, we actually the place that we lived was right across the street from Ford's Wayne Assembly Plant in Michigan. And so growing up, I always thought, well, it's normal to have massive factories near you on a regular basis. And then in college and sort of, getting a chance to see other parts of the world, I realized how special it was for these businesses to transform the way we live, right? And they do that in a way of, these almost marvelous scales of engineering and manufacturing. And so, I really admired Ford for what they did. And I wanted to be a part of that in their next step of their journey.
So now you say, okay, hey, yeah, and they're probably not quite as normal, but I get you growing up, that's what you know, and just like everybody else. But you say, okay, Ford's a great place to be, has big presence within the auto manufacturer. So you apply there, obviously got a job. Now, how did you get into electric vehicles? Is that something that was the open department, or you wanted to get into that, or kind of walk us through a little bit of how you
Yeah.
started to go in that direction?
So, I joined as part of, they have a rotation program for college graduates where you get to sort of like go and experience different departments. And then when I landed in the research department, I just sort of fell in love with it in terms of like working on the next cool things, the greatest things that, that Ford was coming up with. And I really got a lot of energy and passion out of doing that for the first couple of years while I was there.
So walk us through. So you were there, you were working on it, doing the R&D, and because I think you said you started to see maybe a disconnect or a gap between some of the hardware and the software and the sensors and kind of how they are all intermixed. But kind of walk us through how you came to that conclusion, how that came about.
Yeah, yeah. So I spent the first few years in sort of their R&D team, and then actually spent a little bit of time in their mobility incubator, sort of launching new groups within Ford. And there I got to see sort of both sides of the business, both sort of how um, things are started, but also how things are sort of ideated from the first step. And the field of mobile robots always a field I loved. I'd look out into the field and be like, these are all super awesome what they're doing. But I'm not necessarily like particularly a sensor fusion or this like deep software level of autonomy. And so I thought, well, that's not much I can contribute there. But as I looked out into the field and started, talking to people and understanding the problems, I started to realize, well, in the same way that, I'm not a sensor fusion expert, a lot of these companies are not hardware experts. They're not thinking about it from the perspective of how do I make something that I'm going to go make a million of them, in a couple of years? How do I scale this thing so it's reliable for a decade plus? And that's really where we saw the opportunity to be the hardware partner for a lot of these robotic companies.
So now you said, okay, I see the opportunity. Now you're working, if I recall, and putting words in your mouth, but certainly feel free to correct them. You were doing working for Ford full time. You saw this opportunity. Now, how did you kind of say, okay, there's maybe a bit of a gap or an opportunity in the marketplace? I think you said you set it up as a side hustle or kind of started to explore. So how did you kind of start to take advantage or explore that as you realize there's a potential opportunity there?
Yeah, so the way I sort of thought about it was I tried thinking back to like the first principles of it all, right? Because as I looked at these companies, I was like, okay, there are some parts that we're all going to use the same, right? That starting off, you're not going to be able to design custom everything, right? There's going to be things you just use off the shelf and sort of to go faster.
Hmm.
And I would go off and I'd sort of think about what do these customers actually want? I tried talking to them and understanding. I think in hindsight, I probably would have built even less. I was trying to build less at the time, but I would have built even less if I were to do it again. Of
Hmm.
really trying to understand what they were looking for first. Like what is that core kernel of pain that I can best solve first before sort of going on to the next step and the next step. But that was sort of the first bit of, I'd say almost a year of just researching, understanding, doing little prototypes of what are those actual pain points that they're experiencing and how can I best help in those areas.
No, and I think it's always a balance. How long do you spend that time? And the more a lot of times usually if you want to jump in, you want to get going, you're excited about the opportunity, and so you don't spend enough time, and then you always look back and say, hey, I could have spent a bit more time in understanding things, but hindsight's always 2020. But you spend some time figuring those things out. Now, did you just go off on your own, start a side hustle? Did you pull in or co-partner or co-founders or partners, or did you put out a MVP, or did you put out software? Did you put out hardware, or did you just
Yeah.
how did walk us through a little bit of how you got after you did a little bit of that research, how you got things going?
Yeah, so the first 4 or 5 months or so, I built prototypes in my garage, right? So it was just me sort of going through, and a little bit was just sort of my own validation, right? It had been a while since I'd done hardcore engineering, been in this like mobility incubator as purely business for a couple of years. And it gave me more of the confidence to understand, okay, this is, I still understand the process, still understand what I'm doing. And the next step was bringing in co-founders to think about, okay, if I were going to go to the next steps, who are the right people to bring along in the journey who can really help me out and sort of take me to the next stage of what we need to do. And then I would say we really built our first MVP. So
Just
about
one question, just to dive here. Where did you go about finding those co-founders? So is it people you knew in your network, reached out to random people, went on forums, all the
yes.
above, none of the above? Kind of how'd you find them?
So luckily I knew a lot of them simply from this like college experience, right? Of like working together and sort of one of the nice things about that, it was probably the most stressful situations of all of our lives up to that point.
Hmm.
And so you really get to learn how someone operates under stress. And I think not just stress, but when things don't always go right. Because in the journey, we always like we want everything to go perfect the entire time, right? That's the plan, that's the assumption, but life never goes that way. And so it was important to me to sort of bring on people who are going to be resilient and are going to understand that the journey is not going to be a one, just up and to the right. It's going to sort of have ups and downs, and yeah. So luckily, I had that network of people to sort of lean on for sort of the first few people to bring on.
Awesome. No, definitely makes great to have those type of people in the network. So you said, okay, got the network built out a bit, or got the people identified the people that are going to be good to have on the team. Have the idea, did some research, built some prototypes in your garage. Now, walk us through, because you started out kind of doing this as a side hustle. I assume kind of all you guys were putting in your sweat equity, doing it nice weekends and those type of things. And how did you build it out? And because eventually you transitioned to doing it full time, so kind of walk us through how you made that transition.
Yeah. So the way we sort of made that transition was we came to the point where we had to make a decision whether we were going to bring on more people, and there was just a limit to how big my garage was to have more people. And so we decided to, rent out a small commercial space and sort of move in and start doing it full time. We decided once we were moving into a space, that was sort of the threshold to go full time. Um, Although I'd say in hindsight, we probably should have spent more time in my garage, and before we brought on more people, simply from the fact of it's sometimes it's easy to feel like you've made progress with those steps, right? Because there's some sort of change or some sort of thing that like is progressing, but it's not necessarily the part that moves the needle for the business. It's sort of almost like a necessary step, and it's easy, at least for the first like company I started. This is my first company. Um, it's easy for that to feel like progress when it's not really progress.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's always exciting to come up with the name of the business or the logo. And not to say you don't need a name of the business or the logo, but that is a very small step in a much
Right.
larger process. And yet it feels like, hey, we've defined the business and that's what it is. And so I think there's always that sense of accomplishment, and probably good in the sense that if you don't have those small wins early on in the business, you're probably never going to make it too far. So it probably all works out in the end. So now you guys get some space, say, okay, we've got it, we've grown to the point where we're getting some space, makes sense to go full time. So you guys kind of make the transition or go full time. Now, what kind of time period was that? How long ago did you guys make that jump over to be doing this full time?
It was a little over 2 years ago now. Yeah, we went full time on it. Yeah.
So now you make the jump over, do it full time, and you have the space. You start to bring people on. Now walk us through how did that go? Sometimes you jump into it and takes like off like a rocket ship, and money rains down from the skies. And other times you are teetering on the verge of bankruptcy and or second guessing yourself. And a lot of times it's somewhere in between. So walk us through a little bit as to after you guys jumped over full time, how kind of things went and how things have progressed.
Yeah, so we still knew that with the product needed a lot of work to sort of get out to the customer. One of the big things was our customers require a lot of reliability and dependability. So we couldn't sort of give them anything that was halfway there, and we experimented with them and sort of get to the point. So there was a lot of iterations of seeing, okay, how do we do testing with this thing? How do we do durability stuff? And I think at that point we might have spent probably a little too much time sort of churning our wheels of saying, well, instead of just getting it in the customer's hand and saying, well, it's free, right? Just give us, if that is the requirement, that is it needs to be reliable, it needs to be dependable. Why don't we get more data from you of understanding what are those true requirements? And the best way to get that is just get in-field data. Um, and instead we sort of spent probably a little too much time of like taking a lot of assumptions of what our requirements were going to be, because it's still a new field. It's not like we can go out into the market and say, well, there exists 7 different products. We'll sort of benchmark each of the products and understand. And we sort of had to go out and figure some of those on our own. So I'd say like the first like 8, 9 months or so were a little bit of a bit of a peak, and then sort of like wallow down and sort of a little bit of a down point of just we didn't have any customers yet. We were still in the R&D phase. We were still trying to understand who our like ideal customer profile was going to be. But then around that time, we sort of got more of a core traction of like what we wanted to be, how we sort of wanted to get in the next stage of the business.
No, and there's always a bit of that evolution that they're evolving and iterating as the business goes, and figuring out who your ideal or customer is and what they want, and kind of going through that exercise. So it sounds like par for course a bit on that. So now walk us through. So you've done that. You've been in business a couple of years. You kind of figured that out. Continue to, and probably still continue to evolve. But where is the business at today? Kind of walk us through, catch us up as to how things are going, where things are headed. Where do you see the things going in the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah. So right now we have a number of customers using the robots, so in a variety of different cities and areas. Some are doing food and grocery delivery, some are doing like factory automation, some are doing a bunch of different applications. Um, One thing that we realize in the term of like at the core we're a supplier, right? At the core of our sort of how the business is designed is we're a supplier. And as we look to the next stage of raising money, one of the things, the feedbacks we always got was that as a supplier, it's hard to control your destiny. It's hard to control sort of your growth trajectory because it relies on your customers. So we're deciding to sort of play our game in one of the verticals of understanding, okay, let's run some of these robots ourselves. Let's go actually understand the field, how we're going to use these, like how we're going to do it. And it's not the core business of what we eventually want to do, but it's a way to accelerate the business a lot. So we're choosing golf courses as our next like course of action.
Interesting. Now, just out of curiosity, anything, what is the drive with golf courses, or what would you do with golf courses? You know, it's in my mind, and by all means, I'm not the expert or the one that's entrenched in the field, but wouldn't have been the place where I would have maybe jumped off or started with. So, kind of what's in within the golf course industry that lends itself to what you guys are doing?
So the golf course industry has a couple nice features. One, it's all private land. So anytime you're doing robotics or things like that, there's always a risk profile of being in public spaces, right? So that's a huge one where it's sort of a contained area. You can really set a literal fence in many cases of like where the robots can and can't go. Um, Two, it's a very specific use case in customer. So what we're thinking about is doing a ball picker for the driving range, mowing parts of the lawn, and a delivery robot on the course itself when people are, want snacks or drinks or whatever while they're playing. So that really contained area allows us to sort of have this customer who might want, each individually might want maybe 10 or 15 robots, and still allow us to test all the things we want to do outside. How is it going to do in the rain? How is it going to do up and down various types of terrain, bumps, potholes, things like that? So it still gives us the same things that we were hoping to test out in the real world, but it does so in a more contained environment that we can better service these customers with.
No, okay, that makes sense, and sounds like it's a great place to start, and gives you kind of that confines of, hey, we have a set world of, and it also is on a private land, and so it gives you a lot of those abilities to work things out without having major repercussions if something doesn't work or 100% perfectly out of the chute. So it sounds like a great place to start out. So. Well, so now as we reach kind of the present day of the journey and even seeing a little bit of where you guys are headed, great time to transition to the two questions I always like to ask at the end of each episode. So we're already there. So the first question I'd like to ask is, along your journey, what was the worst business decision you ever made? What'd you learn from it?
Hmm. I think the worst business decision for me was undervaluing what our product was worth. That by far of like really understanding it, not from understanding the value that you create for the customer, not like a cost plus basis of like how you build the product. And that was something that I had to unlearn from being from automotive, where it's hyper competitive, it's hyper sort of margin focused, and so you think about how do I get 1 or 2% extra because you're selling 50,000 of them. And so in industries like this, it's not you're not trying to get 1 or 2% extra. You're trying to solve a problem for them. And so how well you can solve that problem is how you create value, not necessarily, what does it cost me to build this thing plus some amount of fixed percentage. And I think that was a big mistake when I started the business.
Yeah, and that's always a hard one, especially when you're in a market where people, there isn't a lot of comparables or there isn't a lot of benchmarks to point towards. You don't want to undersell or go too low, but by the same token, you don't want to price yourself out of the marketplace when you're trying to convince people. And so it's that balance, and easy
Right.
place to make a mistake, but a great one to learn from. Second question now that I like to ask is, so now if you're talking to somebody that's just getting into a startup or a small business, what would be the one piece of advice you give them?
Really talk to your customers. The advice I'd give is really talk to your customers and understand what they need, not what they want.
Hmm.
I think that was the one thing I think, you know, it's almost like a constant learning, being able to read between the lines, like the old Henry Ford quote. If I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. It's along those same lines of really trying to understand what is the actual things that are stopping their business from growing or causing issues for their business, not things that are nice to have. And sometimes it's hard to delineate those lines, but getting really good at delineating between what those are, make the business far more successful than anything else.
No, I think that's a great takeaway. And it is, you ask people what they want. Same thing with if you're asking what they want with the smartphone. They want it, it used to be smaller. Now it's bigger with the bigger screen and maybe a little bit brighter. And yet, that maybe incrementally moves things along a little bit, but it really doesn't spur that innovation. And yet you have to, if you really understand the core of what they want, then it can give you an idea as to now here's where I can innovate. So I love that as a piece of takeaway. Well, now as we do wrap up the episode, if people want to reach out to you, they want to be a customer, they want to be a client, they want to be an employee, they want to be an investor, they want to be your next best friend, any or all of the above, what's the best way to reach out to you, contact you, find out more?
Yeah, feel free to add me on LinkedIn or follow Intermode at LinkedIn as well. That's usually I'm pretty active on there. Also, you can follow me on Twitter at Arnold Kadiu. But yeah, happy to talk to anyone who wants to talk, even if it's just to talk robots.
Awesome. Well, I definitely encourage people to reach out, support a great business, and if nothing else, make a new best friend. So, with that, thank you again, Arnold, for coming on the podcast. It's been fun. It's been a pleasure. Now, for all of you other listeners that are out there, if you have your own journey to share and you'd like to be a guest on the podcast, we'd love to have you. So, let's go to inventiveguest.com, apply to be on the show. A couple more things as listeners. Make sure to click share, subscribe, leave us a review. Helps us to reach even more startups and small businesses to help them along their journey to success. And on that note, if you ever need help along your journey with the patents or trademarks or anything else with your startup, your small business, just go to strategymeeting.com, grab some time with us to chat. We're always here to help. Well, thank you again, Arnold, for coming on the podcast, and wish the next leg of your journey even better than the last.
Thank you. It's great being here.